3 miles above sea level in the Colorado Rockies, Jake Morrison's weathered hands gripped his coffee mug as the first snowflakes began to fall. The weather radio crackled with emergency warnings. A Category 5 blizzard was bearing down on the mountain, promising 12 hours of hell that would test every soul brave enough or foolish enough to face it. Jake had built his cabin 15 years ago when he fled civilization, seeking peace after 2 decades as a Navy SEAL. The nightmares from Afghanistan had driven him here to this isolated peak where no one could find him. His nearest neighbor lived 40 miles down the mountain. No cell towers, no rescue teams, just him, his cabin, and whatever Mother Nature decided to throw at him. As the wind began to howl and the cabin's timber frame groaned under the first assault, Jake noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh tracks in the snow circling his property. Human tracks. Someone had been watching him, waiting for the storm to isolate him completely. But what Jake didn't know was whether his uninvited visitor was friend or foe, and why had they chosen tonight to make their presence known. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The coffee turned bitter in Jake's mouth as he studied the tracks through his frost-covered window. Whoever had made them wore military-grade boots. The tread pattern was unmistakable. Deep, purposeful impressions that spoke of someone who knew how to move through snow without losing their footing. The spacing between steps suggested height and confidence. This wasn't some lost hiker stumbling through his property. Jake set down his mug and moved to the old steamer trunk beside his stone fireplace. His hands, scarred from countless missions and 15 years of mountain living, worked the familiar combination lock with muscle memory. Inside lay remnants of his former life, a Sig Sauer P-226, ammunition, night vision goggles, and a tactical knife that had saved his life more times than he cared to count. The wind picked up, rattling the cabin's windows like skeletal fingers against glass. Snow began falling harder now, thick flakes that would soon erase all evidence of his mysterious visitor. Jake checked the weapons magazine, fully loaded. Some habits died hard, even in retirement. Thunder rumbled overhead, an ominous sound that meant the storm's fury was just beginning. In Afghanistan, Jake had learned to trust his instincts above all else. Right now, every nerve in his body screamed danger. The timing was too perfect, someone waiting for nature's own cover to make their move. He pulled on his heavy winter coat and stepped onto the covered porch, immediately assaulted by wind that threatened to knock him sideways. The tracks led from the tree line, circled his cabin twice, then disappeared back into the forest. Professional reconnaissance. Someone had been mapping his defenses, noting entry points, counting windows and doors. The question was why. Jake had been careful to leave no trail when he'd disappeared into these mountains. He'd changed his name, paid for everything in cash, never used credit cards or made phone calls that could be traced. His old unit believed he was dead. Officially, Jake Morrison had died in a training accident 3 years after his discharge. It was easier that way, cleaner than explaining why he couldn't sleep through the night without seeing the faces of everyone he'd failed to save. A branch snapped somewhere in the darkness beyond his porch light. Jake's hand instinctively moved to the weapon concealed beneath his coat. The sound was too sharp, too deliberate to be natural. Something was moving out there, using the storm's noise as cover. He retreated inside and began his preparations. If someone wanted to play games in a blizzard, they'd picked the wrong mountain man. Jake moved methodically through his cabin, checking locks, ensuring his wood stove was properly stocked, and setting up sight lines to cover all approaches. The military training that had saved his life in hostile territories would serve him well here. The weather radio squawked again, wind speeds now exceeding 90 miles per hour, visibility near zero. All residents are advised to shelter in place. This storm system is unprecedented in its intensity and duration. Perfect conditions for someone who wanted to remain unseen. Jake killed the lights and used the night vision goggles to scan his property. Nothing moved in the swirling white chaos, but he knew better than to trust appearances. Patience was a sniper's greatest weapon, and he'd been one of the best. The cabin shuddered as a massive gust struck its walls. Somewhere in the distance, a tree crashed to the ground with a thunderous crack. Nature was unleashing her full fury now, turning the mountain into a frozen battlefield where visibility and conventional rules of engagement meant nothing. Jake settled into his old wooden chair, weapon within easy reach, eyes fixed on the windows. Whatever was coming for him would have to survive the storm first. But as the wind howled and snow began piling against his door, he couldn't shake the feeling that his visitor was better prepared than most people would expect. The wind hit like a freight train at 3 in the morning, rattling the cabin's reinforced windows and sending a cascade of loose snow down the chimney. Marcus Kane jerked awake, his hand instinctively reaching for the Glock 19 he kept in the nightstand drawer. Old habits, the kind that had kept him alive through 6 deployments and countless operations that officially never happened. He lay still, listening. The storm had arrived ahead of schedule, and it sounded like hell unleashed. The weatherman had called for 8 to 12 inches. This sounded like 3 times that, minimum. The cabin groaned under the assault, but the structure was solid. He'd reinforced every beam and joint himself over the past 2 years. Kane swung his legs out of bed and padded barefoot across the cold wooden floor to the window. Through the glass he could see nothing but a wall of white. The motion sensor lights he'd installed around the perimeter were invisible, swallowed by the blizzard. Even the massive pine that stood 30 feet from his front door had vanished into the maelstrom. He pulled on jeans and a thick wool sweater, then made his way to the kitchen. The coffee maker's clock read 3:17 a.m., but sleep was gone for the night. As he filled the kettle, the lights flickered twice, then died completely. "Right on schedule," he muttered, feeling his way to the kitchen drawer where he kept a tactical flashlight. The LED beam cut through the darkness as he moved to the basement door. His backup generator kicked in automatically, the steady rumble barely audible above the storm's roar. Emergency lighting came online throughout the cabin, not bright, but enough. Kane had learned to prepare for worst-case scenarios long before the Navy taught him the finer points. Growing up with an alcoholic father in rural Montana had been boot camp for survival. The military had just refined those skills and given him deadlier applications for them. He climbed back upstairs and started a fire in the stone fireplace, more for psychological comfort than warmth. The cabin's insulation was military-grade. As orange flames began to dance across the hearth, he settled into his leather chair with a cup of instant coffee and tried to calculate how long this would last. The weather service had predicted the storm would blow through in 18 hours, but Kane had seen enough weather in the mountains to know predictions were often wishful thinking. He had food for 3 weeks, water for longer, and enough fuel for the generator to run 2 weeks if he was careful. The wood stove could handle heating without electric power. A sharp crack echoed through the cabin, different from the wind's constant howl. Kane set down his coffee and moved to the front window, flashlight in hand. He cupped his hand against the glass and peered out, but visibility was maybe 10 feet. Could have been a branch snapping under the weight of snow or the stress of the wind. In these conditions, trees fell regularly, but something felt wrong. The hair on the back of his neck was standing up, and that particular early warning system had never failed him. Not in Kandahar, not in Syria, not in the places that didn't appear on any map. He moved through the cabin systematically, checking each window, listening for anything that didn't belong to the storm's symphony. The motion sensors were useless in these conditions. The blowing snow would trigger false alarms constantly. His usual perimeter was compromised. Kane retrieved his rifle from the bedroom closet, a modified AR-15 that he'd legally purchased but illegally enhanced with skills learned in less regulated parts of the world. He checked the magazine, chambered a round, and set it within easy reach of his chair. Paranoia, most likely. 2 years of isolation had a way of making shadows seem like threats, but paranoia had kept him alive when his entire unit had been compromised in that Syrian village, when command had written them off and enemy fighters were closing in from 3 sides. He'd learned to trust the feeling. The wind shifted, and for a moment the constant battering eased. In that brief lull, Kane heard something that made his blood freeze, the distant sound of an engine, barely audible but definitely there. Not a car engine, something heavier, diesel. No one should be out in this storm. The road to his cabin was treacherous even in good weather, a winding mountain track that required four-wheel drive and local knowledge. In a blizzard like this, it would be impassable for any normal vehicle, which meant whoever was out there wasn't normal, wasn't local, and wasn't here by accident. Kane killed the emergency lighting and moved away from the windows. The fire would still be visible, but there was no helping that now. He pulled on his boots and winter jacket, checking the knife on his belt and the spare magazine in his pocket. 2 years of peace were over. Whatever had found him in this storm wasn't going to wait for better weather. The wind had teeth now, gnawing at the cabin's weathered logs with a fury that made Marcus question every joint and beam he'd reinforced over the years. He stood at the kitchen window, watching pine trees bend at impossible angles, their tops disappearing into the grey-white maelstrom that had swallowed the world beyond his property line. The radio crackled with emergency broadcasts between bursts of static, 100-mile-per-hour winds, temperatures dropping to -40, power grids failing across 3 states. The storm of the century, they called it, as if nature needed a ranking system for its violence. Marcus had weathered storms before, literal and metaphorical. Afghanistan had taught him that survival was 90% preparation and 10% adapting when everything went sideways. He'd spent the morning securing loose items, checking his generator and inventorying supplies. Food for 2 weeks, water for longer if he melted snow, enough firewood to outlast an ice age. The cabin was his fortress and he knew every inch of it. But something felt wrong. It started as an itch between his shoulder blades, the kind of hypervigilance that had kept him alive in hostile territory. He'd learned to trust that feeling more than his eyes or ears. His body was telling him he wasn't alone on the mountain, despite the impossibility of anyone traveling in these conditions. He moved away from the window and checked the shotgun propped beside the front door. Loaded, safety off. Old habits. His Beretta sat in its holster on the kitchen table, along with 2 spare magazines. Paranoid, perhaps, but paranoia had saved his life more times than he could count. The power flickered, held, then died with a finality that seemed to mock his preparations. The sudden silence was deafening. No hum of the refrigerator, no whisper of electric heat, just the howling wind and the subtle groans of the cabin's frame under assault. Marcus flipped the generator switch. The backup power kicked in with a reassuring rumble, bringing light back to his sanctuary. He'd installed the system himself, along with enough fuel to run it for days. The military had taught him redundancy in everything. He was checking the fuel gauge when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the storm's symphony. A metallic clink, brief but distinct, coming from somewhere near the back of the cabin. Marcus froze, every sense sharpening to combat readiness. Could have been anything. A tree branch hitting the propane tank, ice breaking off the roof. The storm was a chaos of noise and motion, but his training screamed otherwise. He'd heard that exact sound before, the soft collision of gear against metal, the kind of noise made by someone carrying equipment in harsh conditions. Moving with practiced silence, Marcus killed the interior lights and grabbed his pistol. The cabin's layout was burned into his muscle memory from countless sleepless nights pacing these rooms. He navigated to the back window without a sound, keeping low and to the side of the frame. The world outside was a white hell of driving snow and wind-bent trees. Visibility was maybe 10 feet on a good moment, less when the gusts peaked. Anyone trying to move through this would be fighting just to stay upright, let alone maintain stealth. But someone was out there. He felt it with the certainty of a man who'd spent years reading the invisible signs of human presence. The way the wind patterns seemed slightly off in one spot, a darkness that moved wrong among the trees. Footprints would be erased in seconds, but the human eye could sometimes catch what the mind hadn't yet processed. Marcus controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate with techniques learned in sniper training. Stress narrowed perception when you needed it wide open. He scanned the tree line methodically, dividing his field of view into sectors, spending exactly 3 seconds on each before moving on. There, near the old oak that marked his property's northeast corner, a vertical line where there should have been only the organic curves of nature, gone before he could focus on it, but real enough to spike his adrenaline. Someone was watching his cabin. The smart play was to hunker down, trust in his fortress, and wait it out. The storm was his ally. No one could maintain a siege in these conditions, but Marcus had learned to think like his enemies, and patient surveillance meant professional operators, the kind who might have equipment to survive what nature was throwing at the mountain, the kind who might have followed him all the way to his refuge. His past had finally caught up with him, wrapped in the white shroud of the storm of the century. The question wasn't whether they'd come for him, it was how many, how well equipped, and how long before they made their move. Marcus checked his watch. 4 hours until full darkness. In Afghanistan, that's when the real hunting began. He smiled grimly and chambered around. The wind had teeth tonight, gnawing at the cabin's weathered logs with a hunger that made Marcus question his choice to stay. He'd weathered storms before, but this one felt different, personal, almost vindictive in its assault on his sanctuary. Through the frost-etched window, he watched snow devils dance in spirals, their white forms twisting like ghosts against the darkness. He adjusted the oil lamp's wick, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. The generator had died 3 hours ago, fuel line frozen despite his winterization efforts. No power meant no radio, no weather updates, and no contact with the outside world. Not that he'd planned on calling anyone anyway. The coffee had gone cold in his hands while he'd been lost in thought. Marcus set the mug aside and moved to check his supplies again, a habit drilled into him during countless deployments. Food for 2 weeks, maybe 3 if he rationed carefully. Water wasn't a concern with snow piling up past the windows, but melting it would require fuel he might need for heat. The woodpile outside was substantial, assuming he could reach it through the drifts. A sharp crack echoed through the cabin, distinct from the storm's constant percussion. Marcus froze, every sense suddenly alert. He knew that sound, wood splintering under weight, but the wind could snap branches, could bring down trees. Nothing unusual about that in a storm like this. Another crack, followed by a scraping sound that set his nerves on edge. Marcus moved to the window, pressing his face against the cold glass. The world beyond was a wall of white, visibility reduced to mere feet. The wind howled through the trees, bending them like supplicants before some ancient god. He strained to see past the swirling snow, searching for movement that didn't belong to the storm. There, a shadow shifting near the tree line, too large and purposeful to be wind-blown debris. It moved with deliberation, skirting the edge of his limited vision before disappearing into the white curtain. His hand found the Glock on his hip, without conscious thought, muscle memory overriding years of self-imposed peace. The weight felt familiar, comforting in a way that should have troubled him but didn't. Some instincts were too deeply buried to ever truly die. The scraping came again, closer now, like something being dragged through snow. Marcus killed the lamp with a quick breath, plunging the cabin into darkness. He moved by touch and memory to the corner where his rifle waited, a Winchester, 308 that had served him well in the mountains. His fingers checked the magazine by feel, counting rounds like rosary beads. The storm's rhythm changed, wind gusting in irregular patterns that made it impossible to distinguish natural sounds from potential threats. Marcus controlled his breathing, slowing his heart rate the way his instructors had taught him a lifetime ago. In the darkness, other senses sharpened. The cabin's familiar creaks and sighs told him a story of stress and strain, of wood and metal pushed to their limits. But underneath it all, something else moved. Footsteps, definitely footsteps, crunching through snow somewhere near the cabin's north wall. Heavy, deliberate steps that spoke of someone who knew exactly where they were going despite the blizzard's fury. Marcus felt his jaw clench as old instincts kicked in. Someone was out there in conditions that should have killed them, moving with purpose toward his refuge. The steps circled the cabin slowly, methodically, like a predator sizing up its prey. Marcus tracked the sound, rifle ready, staying well back from the windows. Whoever was out there seemed to be taking their time, learning the layout, maybe looking for weaknesses in his defenses. The footsteps stopped directly outside the front door. Marcus waited, hardly breathing, for the inevitable knock or attempt to force entry. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the storm's relentless assault. Then the steps resumed, moving away from the door toward the back of the cabin where his bedroom window offered another possible entry point. A metallic scraping reached his ears, something being tested, probed. The window latch, maybe, or the shutters he'd installed last summer. Marcus moved through his darkened home like a ghost, avoiding the floorboards that he knew would creak, staying below the sightline of windows. The scraping stopped abruptly, followed by silence that felt more ominous than any sound could have been. Marcus positioned himself with clear views of both the front and back approaches, rifle across his knees, and settled in to wait. Outside, the blizzard raged with undiminished fury, but Marcus no longer heard it as just another storm. It had become something else entirely, a hunting ground where the rules of civilized society held no meaning. Someone had found him in the worst weather he'd seen in years, had tracked him to his sanctuary despite conditions that should have made travel impossible. The question wasn't whether they meant him harm. Anyone who could navigate this storm to reach him was dangerous by definition. The question was what they wanted badly enough to risk dying for it. The wind had teeth now, gnawing at the cabin's reinforced walls with a hunger that made Marcus's bones ache. He'd weathered storms before, in Afghanistan, in the Hindu Kush, where the mountains could swallow a man whole, but this felt different, personal. He crouched beside the window, peering through the narrow gap he'd left uncovered. The world outside had vanished into a writhing mass of white. Visibility was maybe 10 feet on a good gust, less when the wind really picked up. Perfect conditions for an approach. The radio crackled again, that same burst of static followed by silence. Marcus had tried cycling through emergency frequencies for the past hour, but whoever was out there wasn't talking. They were just listening, waiting. His breath fogged the glass as he scanned the tree line. The pines swayed like drunken giants, their branches whipping back and forth in the gale. Between the gusts, he caught glimpses of the clearing where he'd spotted the movement earlier. Nothing now but snow and shadow. Marcus pulled back from the window and checked his watch. 3:15. The storm had been building for 6 hours, and according to the Weather Service's last broadcast before the power died, it wouldn't peak until sometime after midnight. 12 more hours of this hell. The floorboards creaked overhead. Marcus froze, every muscle coiled. The sound came again, a deliberate footstep, not the random settling of old wood. Someone was on his roof. Moving with practiced silence, he reached for the Remington propped against the wall. The weight of it felt good in his hands, familiar. His fingers found the safety, clicked it off. 30-06 rounds, enough to punch through whatever body armor these bastards might be wearing. Another creak, this one moving toward the chimney. Smart. They'd try to come down the flue, probably drop some kind of gas canister first to flush him out. Classic breach and clear tactics. Marcus wasn't going to wait around for the main event. He moved to the back of the cabin, where a narrow maintenance hatch led to the crawl space beneath the floor. He'd reinforced the space years ago, part of his paranoid preparation routine that Sarah used to tease him about. "Not laughing now, are you, sweetheart?" The hatch opened with a soft whisper of hinges. Marcus slithered through, pulling the rifle after him. The crawl space was cramped, barely 3 feet high, but it ran the length of the cabin. More importantly, it had an exit. Above him, boots tramped across the roof. At least 2 sets, maybe 3. They were spreading out, covering all the exits. Professional work. Marcus' army crawled toward the far end of the crawl space, where a concealed panel opened into the root cellar he'd dug the previous spring. The cellar connected to an old mine shaft that emerged 100 yards uphill behind a screen of boulders. his ace in the hole. Something metallic clanged against the chimney. They were coming. He reached the panel just as the first wisps of smoke began filtering through the floorboards above. Not gas, actual smoke. They were trying to burn him out. Crude but effective in a storm like this. The fire department wouldn't be making any house calls tonight. The panel swung open, revealing the narrow tunnel he'd shored up with salvaged timbers. Marcus squeezed through, pulling the Remington behind him. The smoke was getting thicker now, and he could hear voices shouting over the wind. They'd be rappelling down the chimney any second. The tunnel was a tight fit, barely wide enough for his shoulders. He'd built it that way intentionally, easier to defend a narrow space. Behind him, something crashed through the cabin's front window. Glass exploded across the floor, followed by heavy boots and barked commands. Clear left. Kitchen's empty. Check the back rooms. Military precision. These weren't random thieves or drug dealers. Someone had sent professionals. Marcus reached the end of the tunnel and pushed through into the mine shaft. The air here was bitter cold but clean, free of smoke. He could hear his pursuers tearing the cabin apart, looking for him. It wouldn't take long before they found the maintenance hatch. The mine shaft sloped upward at a steep angle, carved into the mountainside by 19th century prospectors who'd died chasing fool's gold. Marcus had explored it thoroughly when he'd first bought the property, mapping every tunnel and dead end. He knew exactly where he was going. 50 yards up the shaft, he reached a natural chamber where the tunnel branched in 3 directions. He chose the middle path, which curved back toward the surface. Behind him, echoing up from the depths, he heard the first pursuit team entering the tunnel system. The hunt had begun in earnest now, but Marcus Kane hadn't survived 3 tours in the sandbox by running scared. These bastards wanted to play hide-and-seek in a blizzard? Fine. Time to show them what a real predator looked like. The wind had shifted again, now howling from the northwest with a ferocity that made the cabin walls groan like an old ship in heavy seas. Marcus pressed his back against the kitchen counter, watching the front door with the intensity of a predator studying prey. The fire in the hearth cast dancing shadows across the room, creating a theater of movement that could hide anything. His radio crackled to life, the static punctuated by a distorted voice. Search Team Alpha, coordinates confirmed, moving to intercept. Marcus lunged for the radio, adjusting the frequency dial with practiced precision. The signal clarified slightly, revealing clipped military communications. Professional, coordinated, not lost hikers or stranded hunters. Copy that, Alpha. Bravo team in position. Target is contained. Target. The word hit him like ice water. Marcus grabbed his rifle and moved to the back window, scanning the tree line through the swirling snow. The storm provided perfect cover, but it cut both ways. They couldn't see him clearly, but he was equally blind to their positions. A metallic clink echoed from somewhere outside, barely audible above the wind, but unmistakably the sound of equipment against frozen metal. Marcus had heard that sound 1,000 times in the field. Combat gear, weapons. He killed the cabin lights and moved with fluid silence toward the cellar access panel he'd built into the kitchen floor. The space below was cramped but defensible, with sight lines to both entrances and emergency exits he'd carved through the foundation years ago. Old habits from a life he'd tried to leave behind. The radio whispered again, visual on the structure, no movement detected. Marcus slipped into the cellar space, pulling the concealed panel shut above him. The darkness was absolute, but his hands found the night vision goggles he'd stashed there by muscle memory. The green-tinted world that materialized was familiar territory, a realm where he'd once been apex predator. Boot steps crunched through snow outside, measured and tactical, at least 4 separate movement patterns, possibly 6. They were surrounding the cabin with textbook precision, which meant whoever sent them knew exactly who they were hunting. Through a crack in the foundation, he watched 2 figures approach the front door. Military bearing, suppressed weapons, coordinated hand signals. The point man tested the door handle while his partner covered the approach. When it didn't yield, they moved to breach positions. Marcus had maybe 30 seconds before they were inside. He belly-crawled toward his emergency exit, a narrow tunnel that emerged 50 yards away in a cluster of boulders. The passage was barely shoulder-width, designed for exactly this scenario. As he moved, he heard the front door splinter inward, followed by the soft whisper of boots on floorboards. Structure clear, target not present. Check for recent activity. Heat signatures on the scope showed occupancy 20 minutes ago. Marcus froze. Heat signatures meant thermal imaging, which explained how they'd tracked him despite the storm. Professional hunters with professional equipment. The question was why. He'd been off the grid for 7 years, invisible to everyone who mattered. Until now. "Sir, we've got fresh coffee, warm fireplace, and gear staged for winter conditions." He was here. Spread out. Check the perimeter. He's close. Marcus resumed his crawl toward the exit, each movement deliberate and silent. The tunnel walls pressed against his shoulders, but the confined space felt safer than the open cabin. Behind him, he could hear systematic searching, furniture being moved, floorboards tested, everything examined with military thoroughness. He reached the tunnel exit and paused, listening. The wind provided acoustic cover, but it also masked approaching footsteps. Marcus eased the camouflaged panel aside and scanned the surrounding terrain. Snow continued to fall in sheets, reducing visibility to mere yards. The radio in his pocket crackled. "Alpha Leader, this is command. Weather window closing fast. You have 40 minutes before extraction becomes impossible." 40 minutes. Whatever they wanted with him, they were working against the storm's timeline too. Marcus could wait them out, let the blizzard force their retreat. But something nagged at him. The precision of their operation, the timing, the fact that they'd found him at all. This wasn't random. Someone with serious resources wanted him badly enough to risk an assault team in near whiteout conditions. He slipped from the tunnel and moved toward a cluster of pine trees that would provide cover and sight lines back to the cabin. His rifle felt natural in his hands, despite years of disuse, muscle memory overriding rust. Whatever skills the world thought he'd forgotten were surfacing like air bubbles rising through dark water. Through the scope, he watched armed figures methodically searching his sanctuary. 7 years of careful isolation, shattered by ghosts from a life he'd abandoned. But as Marcus settled into a firing position, something cold and familiar awakened in his chest. They'd brought the war to his mountain. Now they'd learn why some men choose to disappear. The wind had died to an eerie whisper, and that terrified Marcus more than the howling gale ever had. In his experience, nature's sudden silences meant only one thing: something worse was coming. He crouched behind the overturned table, the Remington steady in his grip, watching the snow-caked windows for movement. The cabin felt like a tomb, insulated by 3 feet of accumulated snow that muffled every sound except his own breathing and the occasional crack of settling timber. A soft scrape against the north wall made him freeze, not the random scratch of wind-blown debris. This was deliberate, methodical. Something was testing the cabin's perimeter. Marcus closed his eyes, filtering out his own heartbeat and focusing on the sounds beyond the walls. There, another scrape, this time near the kitchen window, then silence. Whatever was out there knew he was listening. The smart play would be to stay put, wait it out. But Marcus had learned long ago that passive defense was just delayed dying. He needed intelligence, needed to know what he was facing and how many. The infrared scope on his rifle would cut through the snow glare, but only if he could get a clear line of sight. Moving with practiced silence, he belly-crawled toward the kitchen, keeping below the window line. The floor was littered with broken glass from the earlier breach attempt, and he felt several shards bite through his thermal shirt. He ignored the sting. Pain was just information, and right now he needed to stay focused. At the kitchen window, he slowly raised his head until he could peer through a gap in the snow accumulation. The scope revealed a white hellscape, but the thermal imaging picked up something else: heat signatures, 3 of them, positioned in a loose triangle around the cabin. They weren't moving randomly like animals would. This was coordinated, tactical. The closest signature was maybe 30 yards out, motionless behind what looked like a fallen tree. As Marcus watched, it shifted slightly, and he caught a glimpse of geometric shapes that definitely weren't natural. Equipment, weapons. His blood turned to ice water. These weren't desperate survivors or opportunistic raiders. The positioning, the patience, the coordinated approach, this was military precision. But who? And why? The satellite phone incident replayed in his mind. Someone had been monitoring communications, had known exactly when and how to jam his signal. They'd waited for the storm, used it as cover for an approach that would have been impossible in clear weather. This wasn't random. Someone wanted Marcus Chen specifically. A memory surfaced unbidden. Kandahar, 2018, the mission that had ended his career and started his nightmares. The target had been a high-value asset, a Taliban commander who'd been selling American troop movements to Iranian intelligence. Simple snatch and grab, except nothing about that night had been simple. The compound had been a trap. Someone had sold them out, fed the Taliban detailed intel about the SEAL team's approach routes, timing, everything. 3 good men had died in the ambush that followed, and Marcus had barely escaped with a shattered leg and shrapnel scars that still ached in cold weather. The official investigation had cleared everyone involved, but Marcus had never stopped wondering who'd betrayed them. The Taliban commander had died in the firefight, taking his secrets with him, or so the reports claimed. A soft thump on the roof snapped him back to the present. Heat signature number 4, rappelling down from above. Marcus cursed himself for not checking the thermal scan higher. Amateur mistake, the kind that got people killed. He rolled away from the window just as the kitchen skylight exploded inward, showering the room with glass and snow. A dark shape dropped through the opening, landing in a combat crouch with fluid precision. Marcus caught a glimpse of night vision goggles and military-grade gear before he squeezed off 2 quick shots. The figure dove sideways, returning fire with a suppressed automatic weapon that chewed chunks out of the log wall where Marcus had been crouched. He scrambled backward, using the kitchen island for cover as bullets sparked off pots and pans. The front door exploded off its hinges as the other 3 breached simultaneously, moving with the kind of coordination that took years to perfect. Marcus found himself caught in a crossfire, pinned behind inadequate cover with 4 professionals converging on his position. But they'd made one critical mistake. They were treating this like a standard breach and clear operation. Marcus wasn't a standard target cowering in a corner. He was a predator who'd been pretending to be prey, and now the game was finally interesting. He pulled the pin from a fragmentation grenade, one of 6 he'd retrieved from his hidden cache, and rolled it toward the front entrance. In the 2 seconds before it detonated, Marcus was already moving, using the blast's confusion to vault over the kitchen counter toward the rear of the cabin. The explosion shook the entire structure, and someone screamed, 1 down, maybe 2 if he was lucky. But the other heat signatures were still moving, still hunting. Time to remind them why Navy SEALs were the hunters, not the hunted. The silence that followed the gunshot stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the storm's relentless howling. Marcus pressed his back against the cabin wall, the Remington's weight solid in his hands as he counted heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. Nothing moved in the white void beyond the shattered window. He'd hit something. The spray of dark droplets across the snow confirmed it, but whether he'd wounded or killed remained a mystery swallowed by the blizzard. Marcus forced himself to breathe slowly, fighting the adrenaline that demanded immediate action. Patience had kept him alive through 14 combat deployments. It would serve him now. The wind shifted, carrying with it a sound that made his blood freeze, a low guttural moan that was distinctly human. Wounded then, alive and angry. Marcus moved to the eastern window, keeping low, rifle ready. Through the driving snow, he caught a glimpse of movement near the tree line. A dark shape stumbled between the pines, leaving a crimson trail that the storm quickly erased. The figure moved with purpose despite the injury, circling toward the cabin's rear. They were trying to flank him. The realization hit him like a physical blow. They, plural. In his focus on the wounded attacker, he'd made a tactical error, assuming a single threat when multiple hostiles were the more likely scenario. The hair on his neck prickled as muscle memory from Fallujah kicked in. Never assume you've found them all. A scraping sound from above made him look up sharply. Footsteps on the roof, barely audible over the storm, but unmistakably there. Someone was moving across the metal sheeting, heading toward the chimney. Marcus's mind raced through the implications. They could drop something down the flue, gas, explosives, or simply climb down into the main room. He moved fast, grabbing the cast-iron poker from beside the fireplace and jamming it up the chimney, creating a makeshift barrier. Not perfect, but it would slow them down and alert him to any attempt at entry. The footsteps above paused, then resumed with more urgency. The front door rattled. Marcus spun toward the sound, rifle raised. The door held against the first impact, his reinforcing beam doing its job, but the frame groaned ominously. A second impact followed, then a third, each one accompanied by a string of muffled curses in what sounded like Russian. The pieces began forming a picture Marcus didn't like. Professional operators, multiple entry points, coordinated assault despite the storm. This wasn't random. This was planned. Glass exploded inward from the kitchen window as a figure in Arctic camouflage rolled through the frame. Marcus pivoted and fired, the rifle's report deafening in the enclosed space. The round caught the intruder center mass, dropping him instantly, but the front door splintered open at the same moment. Two more figures burst through, moving with military precision. Marcus dove behind the overturned table as automatic weapons fire erupted, splinters and debris filling the air around him. The muzzle flashes strobed like lightning, casting wild shadows across the cabin walls. He counted the rounds. Short, controlled bursts, professional, conserving ammunition. These weren't desperate men spraying and praying, they were operators who knew their business. Marcus felt a grudging respect, even as he planned their deaths. The firing stopped. In the relative quiet, Marcus heard the distinctive sound of magazines being changed. He rose and fired twice, catching one attacker reloading behind the doorframe. The man dropped, but the second had already moved, disappearing into the kitchen area. Movement above. The chimney barrier rattled as someone tried to descend. Marcus grabbed a burning log from the fireplace and hurled it up the flue. A scream echoed down, followed by the sound of someone scrambling back onto the roof. "Kovac!" The shout came from outside, heavily accented. "You have something that belongs to us." Marcus said nothing, using the momentary pause to reload and reassess. 3 down, at least one wounded on the roof, and who knew how many more positioned outside. His ammunition was finite, his position compromised, and they obviously knew his real name. "We know who you are, Marcus Kovac. Operation Nightfall, Afghanistan, 2019. The files you took, we want them back." The words hit him like a sledgehammer. Nightfall. A mission that officially never happened, buried so deep that even he sometimes wondered if it had been real. But someone knew, someone remembered, and they'd tracked him to this frozen hell to settle an old debt. "You killed our people, Kovac, Dmitry Volkov's people. Did you think we would forget?" Volkov, the arms dealer whose compound they'd hit in the Hindu Kush. The mission that had gone sideways, leaving bodies and burned hard drives in their wake. Marcus had taken insurance, copied files, insurance against the day someone decided he knew too much. That day had apparently arrived. The storm continued its assault on the cabin, but Marcus barely heard it now. His past had finally caught up with him, and the blizzard had become the least of his problems. The wind had shifted during the night, and Marcus woke to an eerie silence that set every nerve on edge. The constant howling that had become his soundtrack for days had reduced to intermittent gusts, creating pockets of absolute quiet that felt more threatening than the storm's full fury. He lay still in his makeshift shelter, listening to the subtle sounds that the wind's retreat had revealed. Footsteps, deliberate and measured, circling the cabin. Marcus slipped his hand to the rifle beside him, thumb finding the safety in one fluid motion. Through the gaps in his fortified walls, pale morning light filtered in, revealing that the blizzard had finally begun to weaken. Visibility would be better now, for him and for them. The footsteps stopped directly outside what used to be his front door. Marcus controlled his breathing, each exhale barely disturbing the frigid air. He'd learned patience in darker places than this, waiting in spider holes and bombed-out buildings for targets who never suspected death watched them through crosshairs. A voice cut through the silence, muffled, but clear enough. "We know you're in there, Reynolds. The storm's breaking up. No more places to hide." Marcus recognized the accent. Eastern European, probably Serbian. The pieces were falling into place now. Not random mercenaries, but professionals with a specific contract. Someone wanted him dead badly enough to send a team into a killer storm. "Your friend up in the tree didn't make it through the night," the voice continued. "Froze solid. That's 3 of us you've taken. The client's not happy about the overtime costs." 3 down. Marcus did the math quickly. Standard kill teams ran 4 to 6 operators for a target like him. At least one more out there, probably positioned as Overwatch, while this one tried to draw him out with conversation. He shifted position carefully, moving toward the small gap he'd left in the north wall. The cabin's layout was burned into his memory. Every sightline, every angle of attack, every possible escape route. His breathing remained steady as he peered through the opening. The speaker stood 20 yards out, assault rifle held ready but not quite aimed. Professional stance, good field discipline. Behind him, the snow had drifted into strange sculptures that could hide a dozen threats, but Marcus's trained eye caught the telltale shadow that didn't belong, the 4th operator, positioned behind a fallen tree, covering his partner. "The contract says dead or alive," the man called out. "But after what you did to Pavel and Dmitri, I'm leaning toward dead. Much tidier that way." Marcus smiled grimly. They were getting impatient, letting the cold and exhaustion affect their judgment. The smart play would be to wait him out, let hunger and hypothermia do their work. Instead, they were giving away positions and numbers. The wind picked up again, sending a curtain of loose snow swirling between the cabin and the operators. Marcus made his decision. He triggered the improvised explosive he'd rigged to the cabin's back wall, a combination of materials that would create more noise and flash than actual destruction, but enough to provide crucial seconds of distraction. As the thunder echoed across the mountainside, Marcus was already moving, exploding through his carefully prepared exit point on the cabin's east side. The snow was knee-deep, but firm enough to support quick movement. Marcus sprinted toward the tree line, using the terrain he'd memorized during 3 years of solitary living. Behind him, shouts erupted, as the operators realized their quarry was mobile. Rifle fire cracked through the air, bullets whining past his head and thudding into tree trunks. Marcus dove behind a boulder, snow exploding around him as more rounds found his position. He was outnumbered and outgunned, but this was his ground, his mountain. Rolling to his left, Marcus brought his rifle up and acquired his first target, the Overwatch position behind the fallen tree. The operator was tracking toward Marcus's last known position, not expecting the flanking movement. Marcus's shot took him center mass, the impact spinning him backward into the snow. "Contact!" The remaining operator's voice cracked with stress as he tried to reposition, realizing his backup was down. Marcus was already moving again, using the confusion to close distance. This wasn't about long-range precision anymore. It was about getting close enough to end it decisively. The snow crunched under his boots as he bounded between cover points, working his way around to flank the last hostile. Through a gap in the trees, he glimpsed movement, the final operator backing toward the cabin, trying to use the structure for cover while maintaining visual contact with where Marcus had disappeared. The man was good, Marcus admitted. Disciplined fire control, smart use of terrain, Under different circumstances, they might have served together, shared the brotherhood of professionals who understood the thin line between life and death. But circumstances were what they were. Marcus settled into position behind a snow-laden pine, rifles steady against the trunk. The crosshairs found their target just as the operator realized his tactical error. He'd boxed himself against the cabin with no escape route. Their eyes met across 30 yards of pristine mountain snow. The mountain held its breath, waiting for the final shot. The wind had died to an occasional whisper, leaving behind an unnatural silence that made every heartbeat sound like thunder in Marcus's ears. He crouched behind the overturned table, rifle steady, watching the shattered window for any sign of movement. Snow drifted lazily through the broken glass, accumulating on the cabin floor in pristine white mounds that would soon be stained red if his suspicions proved correct. 3 minutes passed. 5, 10, nothing. Marcus forced himself to breathe slowly, drawing on years of training that had kept him alive in places where lesser men died screaming. The silence was tactical. His hunters knew he was waiting, knew he was armed, and they were being patient, professional patient. That told him everything he needed to know about what he was facing. These weren't random opportunists or desperate survivors caught in the storm. These were operators. A soft scraping sound came from the roof, so faint he almost missed it. Marcus's grip tightened on the rifle as he tracked the sound's movement from the front of the cabin toward the back. Someone was up there, positioning themselves over the rear window. Classic pincer movement. One would come through the broken front window while another dropped through the back. He had perhaps 30 seconds before they moved. Marcus belly-crawled across the floor, staying below the window line, and positioned himself against the wall between the two windows. From here, he could cover both approaches, but barely. The moment they came through simultaneously, he'd be fighting for his life in a close-quarters battle with nowhere to run. The scraping stopped. In the absolute silence that followed, Marcus heard something that made his blood freeze, the distinctive metallic click of a safety being disengaged. But it hadn't come from the roof or the windows, it had come from directly behind him. "Hello, Marcus?" The voice was calm, almost conversational, with a slight accent he couldn't immediately place. Marcus didn't turn around. Instead, he kept his rifle trained on the front window, mind racing through possibilities. The voice was coming from the direction of his bedroom. Had someone been hiding in his cabin all along? Impossible. He'd swept every inch of the interior. "You're wondering how?" the voice continued. "The answer is simple. We've been watching you for 3 days. We know about your little tunnel. Quite clever, really, but not clever enough." The tunnel. Marcus felt his stomach drop. The emergency escape route he'd carved beneath the cabin floor, connecting his bedroom to a concealed exit 50 yards into the tree line. It had taken him months to excavate and camouflage. If they'd found it, if they'd been watching that long. "Who sent you?" Marcus kept his voice steady, professional. "Does it matter? You know why we're here. You know what you took." "I don't know what you're talking about." A low chuckle. "Marcus Webb, former SEAL Team 6, dishonorably discharged after the Kandahar incident. 3 years ago you disappeared with something that didn't belong to you, something worth more than your hermit lifestyle would suggest." The Kandahar incident. Marcus's jaw clenched. Even after all this time, the memories came flooding back. The compound raid, the unexpected resistance, the choice he'd made that saved civilian lives but cost him his career. And yes, there had been something else, something he'd taken from that compound, something that powerful people very much wanted back. "I destroyed it," Marcus said. "We both know that's not true." Movement in his peripheral vision. Through the front window, a dark shape was sliding through the broken glass with predatory silence. Marcus adjusted his aim slightly, finger finding the trigger. "Here's what's going to happen," the voice behind him continued. "You're going to tell us where it is, and then you're going to take us to it. In exchange, your death will be quick, and if I refuse, then it won't be." The shape by the window had fully entered the cabin now, rising slowly from a crouch. Marcus could see the outline of tactical gear, the professional way the figure moved, but what caught his attention was the device in the person's hand, not a weapon, but some kind of electronic scanner. They weren't just here to kill him, they were here to search. "You have 5 seconds to decide," the voice said. Marcus made his choice. He rolled left and fired in one fluid motion, the rifle's report deafening in the confined space. The figure by the window dropped, but Marcus was already moving, spinning toward the voice behind him while chambering another round. The bedroom doorway was empty. Cursing, Marcus swept the room with his rifle, but his pursuer had vanished as quickly as he'd appeared. The only evidence of his presence was a small electronic device on the floor, some kind of listening device that explained how they'd known about his tunnel. Outside, the storm was picking up again, and Marcus realized with growing dread that the hunt was far from over. If anything, it had just begun. The wind had become a living thing, howling with a voice that seemed to mock Jake's every move. He pressed himself against the frozen trunk of a massive pine, his breath forming crystals that clung to his beard before being torn away by the relentless gusts. The storm had intensified beyond anything he'd experienced in 15 years of mountain living, but it wasn't the weather that had his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the swirling white chaos, he caught glimpses of movement that defied the natural rhythm of the blizzard, shadows that moved with purpose, cutting through the snow with predatory precision. 3 of them now, maybe 4. He'd lost count after the third body had dropped in his cabin, painting the rough-hewn walls with arterial spray that had already begun to freeze. Jake shifted the weight of his rifle, feeling the familiar comfort of the weapon against his shoulder. The Remington 700 had been his companion through countless hunts, but tonight it felt inadequate against whatever was stalking him through the white hell. These weren't ordinary mercenaries or government cleanup crews. They moved too well, too quietly, even in conditions that would cripple most special forces units. A branch snapped somewhere to his left, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the brief lull between wind gusts. Jake's training kicked in, muscle memory overriding the rusty protests of a body that had grown soft from years of self-imposed exile. He dropped to one knee, bringing the rifle to bear on the sound's origin, his breathing controlled despite the adrenaline flooding his system. The scope revealed nothing but dancing snow and skeletal branches, but Jake had learned long ago to trust his instincts over his eyes. Something was out there, using the storm as cover just as he was. The question was whether his hunters had night vision, thermal imaging, or something else entirely that gave them an advantage in these conditions. His radio crackled to life, Sarah's voice cutting through the static like a lifeline. "Jake, you need to get to the old mining station. There's something you need to know about what you found in that case." He keyed the mic twice, not daring to speak. Sound carried strangely in a blizzard, and he couldn't risk giving away his position. The mining station was 2 miles northeast, a treacherous journey even in good weather. In this storm, with killers on his trail, it might as well have been on the moon. Another sound, closer this time. The distinctive whisper of snow being disturbed by something large moving carefully through the drifts. Jake turned slowly, keeping his movements minimal, and caught sight of a figure approximately 30 yards away. Tall, lean, moving with the fluid grace of someone equally at home in urban warfare and wilderness survival. The figure stopped, head turning in Jake's direction with mechanical precision. Even through the swirling snow, Jake could see the distinctive outline of advanced tactical gear, the kind of equipment that spoke of unlimited funding and military contracts that didn't officially exist. A red dot appeared briefly on the figure's chest before disappearing again as the snow intensified. Jake held his breath, finger resting lightly on the trigger. One shot, center mass, and his problems would be reduced by 25%. But gunfire would bring the others running, and in this storm he'd be fighting blind against opponents who clearly had technological advantages. The decision was made for him when the figure raised what looked like a compact submachine gun. Jake squeezed the trigger, the rifle's report swallowed immediately by the wind. The figure spun and dropped, but Jake was already moving. knowing that muzzle flash would have pinpointed his location for any watching eyes. He rolled left, came up running, and immediately tripped over something buried in the snow. As he hit the ground hard, his hands found the obstacle that had brought him down. Another body, this one wearing the same tactical gear as his recent target. The corpse was still warm, which meant his hunters had been busy before finding him. Jake's mind raced as he processed this new information. Someone else was in these woods, someone capable of taking down trained killers in blizzard conditions. An ally or another predator drawn by the scent of blood. The radio crackled again, but this time the voice wasn't Sarah's. It was male, cold, and speaking with the clipped precision of someone accustomed to giving orders that were never questioned. "Mr. Morrison, you're making this unnecessarily difficult. We simply want to talk. Return what you took, and this all ends peacefully." Jake almost laughed at the absurdity of it. 3 dead men in his cabin, and at least one more cooling in the snow around him, suggested these people had a unique definition of peaceful negotiation. He keyed the mic, finally breaking radio silence. "Come and take it." The response was immediate and chilling. "We intend to." The communications tower loomed against the storm like a skeletal finger pointing accusingly at the churning sky. Marcus crouched behind a fallen pine, his breath forming ice crystals that clung to his makeshift face mask. Through the driving snow, he could make out 2 figures moving around the base of the structure, one crouched over what looked like portable equipment, the other standing guard. The setup was more sophisticated than he'd expected. Solar panels glinted dully through the snow accumulation, and thick cables snaked from a weatherproof housing into the ground. This wasn't some hastily assembled operation. Someone had been planning this for months, maybe longer. Marcus studied the guard's movement pattern. 30 seconds clockwise around the tower, pause for 10 seconds scanning the perimeter, then 30 seconds counterclockwise. Professional but predictable. The kind of pattern that would get you killed in hostile territory. He checked his improvised weapons, the knife secured to his thigh, the sling loaded with a sharp stone, and the small explosive he'd fashioned from materials in the cabin. One shot at this, if he failed, the signal would go out, and whatever endgame these people had planned would unfold without him ever knowing why he'd been marked for death. The storm intensified, and Marcus used the howling wind to mask his approach. He belly-crawled through the snow, using terrain features and the limited visibility to stay hidden. 20 yards, 15, 10. The technician looked up from his equipment, shouting something to his partner that was lost in the wind. Marcus caught fragments, signal strength, and 15 minutes, 15 minutes, until what? The timeline was collapsing faster than he'd anticipated. Marcus waited for the guard to begin his clockwise rotation, then moved. His boots found purchase on the frozen ground as he sprinted through the whiteout, closing the distance in seconds. The guard turned just as Marcus reached him, eyes widening behind snow goggles. The knife went in clean between the ribs, angled upward toward the heart. Marcus caught the man's weight as he collapsed, lowering him silently to the snow. The technician, focused on his equipment and deafened by the storm, never looked up. Marcus appropriated the dead man's weapon, a compact submachine gun with a full magazine, and approached the tower from the blind side. The technician was hunched over a laptop connected to the transmission equipment, his fingers flying across the keyboard despite the cold. "Step away from the computer." The man spun around, his face pale in the laptop's glow. Young, maybe mid-20s, with the soft look of someone who spent more time behind a desk than in the field. His hand drifted toward a sidearm holstered at his hip. Don't Marcus kept the SMG trained on center mass. "Hands where I can see them." The technician raised his hands slowly, but his eyes darted toward the laptop screen. Marcus caught a glimpse of the display, a countdown timer showing 14 minutes and 18 seconds, ticking downward. What happens when that reaches 0? I don't know. The lie came too quickly, too practiced. Marcus stepped closer, close enough that the barrel of the weapon pressed against the man's chest. "Wrong answer. Try again." The young man's composure cracked. "Look, I'm just the tech support, okay? They hired me to set up the relay and send the signal when they gave the word. I don't know what it does. Who's they? I never got names. Payment came through cryptocurrency, instructions through encrypted channels. All I know is the target coordinates and the timing. Marcus glanced at the laptop again. 13 minutes. What are the coordinates? The technician hesitated, then rattled off a string of numbers. Marcus felt ice form in his stomach that had nothing to do with the storm. Those coordinates weren't for his cabin or even this mountain. They were for the valley below, where the small town of Cedar Falls lay sleeping under the blanket of snow. How many people live down there? Marcus demanded. I don't know. Couple thousand, maybe? The pieces clicked together with horrible clarity. This wasn't about eliminating one former SEAL who knew too much. This was something bigger, something that required witnesses to be silenced on a much larger scale. His death was just the opening move. Marcus grabbed the laptop, scanning the interface. The system was locked down tight, requiring authorization codes he didn't have. Brute force wouldn't work. The timer would continue counting down regardless. How do I stop it? You can't. Once the sequence starts, it's automatic. The only way to abort is with a code that I don't have. 12 minutes. Marcus's mind raced through options. He could destroy the equipment, but that might trigger a failsafe. He could try to trace the signal path, but that would take time he didn't have. Or he could force the truth out of the technician, but gut instinct told him the kid really didn't know more than he'd already revealed. The storm raged around them, indifferent to human schemes and desperate calculations. Somewhere in the whiteout, the rest of the team was probably wondering why their communications had gone silent. 11 minutes and 37 seconds. Marcus made his choice. The gunshot echoed through the storm like thunder, but Marcus was already moving. The bullet splintered the doorframe where his head had been a heartbeat before. He rolled hard to his right, seeking cover behind the overturned kitchen table as another shot punched through the cabin wall. Wood splinters showered down as he pressed his back against the makeshift barricade. His mind catalogued the situation with cold precision. At least 2 shooters, possibly 3, positioned outside in the storm. Professional spacing. They'd used the blizzard as cover to get close, probably thermal scopes to track his heat signature through the walls. The radio in his pocket crackled. Sarah's voice cut through the static, tense but controlled. Marcus, we're pinned down at the ranger station. Multiple hostiles. The storm's breaking up their communications, but... The transmission dissolved into white noise as another volley of gunfire erupted. Marcus counted the muzzle flashes through the broken windows, 3 distinct positions forming a loose triangle around the cabin. They were trying to box him in, drive him toward a kill zone. He low-crawled toward the back bedroom where he'd stashed his rifle. The Remington 700 felt solid and familiar in his hands as he checked the magazine. 12 rounds, against at least 3 trained killers with superior position and equipment. The odds didn't matter. They never had. Marcus belly-crawled to the rear window and peered through a gap in the boards he'd nailed up earlier. The storm was definitely weakening. Visibility had improved to maybe 30 yards. Through the swirling snow, he caught a glimpse of movement near the tree line, a figure in white winter camouflage advancing with military precision. He lined up the shot, controlling his breathing the way Gunny Martinez had taught him 20 years ago. The crosshairs settled on center mass. His finger found the trigger's sweet spot. The figure stumbled and dropped, a splash of red against the pristine snow. Immediately, the other 2 positions opened up with suppressing fire. Bullets hammered the cabin from multiple angles, forcing Marcus to stay low as he moved to a new position. They were coordinating their assault now, one providing cover while the other advanced. The front door exploded inward under the impact of a breaching charge. Smoke and snow swirled through the opening as a figure in tactical gear rushed inside, weapon raised. Marcus put 2 rounds center mass before the man could acquire a target. The body hit the floor hard, assault rifle clattering across the wooden planks. The woman who entered moved like a dancer, all fluid grace and lethal purpose. Her winter whites were pristine except for the tactical vest bristling with equipment. She had her rifle up and ready, but when she saw Marcus, something flickered across her face. "Hello, Marcus." Her voice was cultured, European. "You're a difficult man to kill, lady. I don't even know who you are." "Katerina Volkov. I knew your friend Mitchell quite well." The name hit like a physical blow. Marcus kept his rifle trained on her, but his mind raced. Mitchell had been his spotter in Afghanistan, killed in an ambush outside Kandahar, or so he'd been told. Mitchell's been dead for 8 years. "Has he?" Her smile was winter cold. "He spoke of you often during his debriefing in Moscow. Quite the detailed account of your missions together. Very valuable intelligence." The betrayal cut deeper than any bullet could. Marcus felt something fundamental shift inside him. A final door slamming shut on the man he'd tried to become. The hermit who'd hidden in these mountains, running from his past, ceased to exist. Where is he? Safe, comfortable, living under a new name in Siberia with his wife and daughter. A daughter he never had the chance to meet before his supposed death. She was talking to keep him distracted, Marcus realized. Somewhere in the storm, more shooters were moving into position. This had been a delaying tactic from the start. "Why tell me this?" "Because Mitchell asked me to offer you the same deal. Your government abandoned you, Marcus, left you to rot in these mountains while lesser men took credit for your work. We can offer you something better." Marcus's finger tightened on the trigger. "And what's that?" "Purpose." The radio crackled again. Sarah's voice, urgent. "Marcus, we've got movement on the access road. Vehicles approaching your position. Get out of there now." Katerina's smile widened. "You have 30 seconds to decide. Come with us willingly, or we take you by force." Marcus heard the distant rumble of engines growing closer through the storm. Multiple vehicles, a full extraction team. He looked at Katerina, this elegant killer who claimed to know his deepest betrayals, and made his choice. The rifle bucked against his shoulder. The wind had died to an eerie whisper, transforming the landscape into a crystalline tomb. Marcus crouched behind the overturned snowmobile, his breath forming small clouds that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. The silence was more unnerving than the howling blizzard had been. In the storm, he could blame his paranoia on poor visibility and disorientation. Now, with the world laid bare in moonlit snow, every shadow held potential death. He'd been tracking the remaining 2 operatives for the better part of an hour, following their trail through the drifts. Their prints told a story of desperation, wider spacing indicating fatigue, occasional stumbles where boots had caught in deeper snow. They were making mistakes, but Marcus knew better than to underestimate wounded prey. Cornered animals were always the most dangerous. The radio crackled softly against his chest. He'd taken it from Rodriguez's body, hoping to intercept communications. Static filled the channel, then a voice cut through the white noise. "Control, this is Viper 2. We've lost contact with the primary team. Repeat, Blackwood is still active." Marcus adjusted the frequency, listening as another voice responded. "Understood, Viper 2. Terminate with extreme prejudice. No witnesses. The storm provides perfect cover." Perfect cover. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same storm that had nearly killed him was now his greatest ally. He keyed the radio, mimicking Rodriguez's accent as best he could. "Viper 2, this is Rodriguez. I have eyes on the target. Moving to intercept from the North Ridge." A pause. "Rodriguez, we thought you were down. Confirm your position." Marcus's jaw tightened. He'd bought himself seconds, maybe minutes, taking heavy fire. "Radio damaged. Will maintain radio silence until objective complete." He switched off the device and began moving again. The false communication would send them toward the North Ridge, giving him time to circle around. The cabin's smoking ruins were visible in the distance, a black scar against the pristine wilderness. Everything he'd built, everything he'd tried to become in his isolation, reduced to ash and memory. The sound reached him before he saw movement. the soft squeak of boots on packed snow. Marcus dropped prone, the rifle settling naturally into his shoulder. Through the scope he could see them, two figures moving with military precision across the open ground below. They'd taken his bait, heading toward the false position he'd given them. One was tall and lean, moving with the fluid grace of a seasoned operator. The other was shorter, stockier, carrying what looked like a sniper rifle. As Marcus watched, they spread out, maintaining proper spacing and communication discipline. These weren't the desperate amateurs their footprints had suggested. They were adapting, learning, becoming more dangerous with each passing hour. The tall one raised his hand, and both men froze. Marcus held his breath, knowing that any movement could give away his position. Through the scope, he watched the operative scan the tree line with methodical precision. The man's gaze swept past Marcus's hiding spot, paused, then continued. Professional, but not perfect. Marcus shifted his aim to the sniper, recognizing the greater threat. The man was setting up behind a fallen log, establishing a firing position with a clear view of the North Ridge. Smart. They were using the false information while still maintaining tactical awareness. Whoever had trained these men had done it well. The wind picked up again, sending streamers of snow across the open ground. Marcus used the cover to adjust his position, moving 15 feet to his left where a cluster of pine trees provided better concealment. The movement was silent, controlled, every lesson from his SEAL training manifesting in muscle memory he'd thought was buried forever. His radio crackled again. This time, a different voice. All units be advised. Target is former naval special warfare. Treat as extremely dangerous. Do not engage alone. Too late for that advice. Marcus counted at least 4 bodies scattered across the wilderness, testament to just how dangerous he could be when the situation demanded it. But he felt no satisfaction in the killing, only a hollow recognition that some skills never truly fade. The sniper was almost in position now, his rifle trained on the ridge where Marcus was supposed to be. The spotter continued scanning, but his attention was focused in the wrong direction. Marcus had perhaps 30 seconds before they realized their mistake. He steadied his breathing, finger moving to the trigger. The crosshairs settled on the sniper's center mass, compensation for wind and distance becoming automatic calculations. This was the moment that would define the next phase of the hunt. Success meant reducing the odds, failure meant revealing his true position and losing the only advantage he had left. The wind died again, leaving perfect stillness. Marcus exhaled slowly, the world narrowing to the space between rifle and target. In the distance, wolves howled, their voices carrying across the frozen landscape like an ancient warning. The hunt was far from over, but the balance was about to shift once again. The explosion behind him rattled his teeth and sent a shockwave through the snow-laden trees. Marcus didn't look back as he sprinted through the forest, his makeshift snowshoes biting into the deep powder with each desperate stride. The cabin, his sanctuary for 3 years, was gone, reduced to splinters and flame by the thermite charges he'd rigged as a last resort. Behind him, voices cut through the howling wind. Russian. At least 4 of them, maybe more. The hunter had become the hunted, and now he was running blind through a blizzard that showed no signs of relenting. His breath came in sharp bursts, each exhale creating crystalline clouds that the wind immediately tore away. The storm that had been his enemy was now his only ally, providing cover as he moved deeper into the wilderness. But it was a double-edged sword. If he couldn't see them, navigation became a nightmare. A rifle crack split the air, followed by the distinctive whine of a bullet passing overhead. Too close. They were using thermal scopes, cutting through his advantage. Marcus veered left, using a cluster of ancient pines as cover, their massive trunks providing momentary protection. His mind raced through options as his body moved on instinct. The ranger station was 12 miles northeast, but in these conditions it might as well be on the moon. The old mining road was closer, maybe 4 miles, but it would be impassable in this weather. Then he remembered the cave system, a series of limestone caverns he'd explored during his first winter here. dangerous in good weather, potentially deadly now, but it offered something the surface couldn't: true concealment. Another shot rang out, this one from a different direction. They were trying to flank him. Standard pursuit tactics. Professional soldiers, not the mercenaries he'd initially assumed. The realization sent ice through his veins that had nothing to do with the temperature. If Kozlov had sent Spetsnaz operatives, this was bigger than just revenge for Budapest. Marcus dropped into a ravine, using the depression to mask his heat signature. The snow here was deeper, nearly to his chest, but it would buy him precious seconds. He checked his remaining ammunition, 8 rounds in the Glock, plus the 2 magazines he'd grabbed. Not enough for a prolonged firefight against multiple hostiles with superior equipment. The wind shifted, and for a moment the snow cleared enough to reveal shapes moving through the trees above. 4 figures in white winter gear, advancing with military precision. Marcus pressed himself against the ravine wall, counting heartbeats as they passed overhead. When their footsteps faded, he began moving again, following the natural contours of the land toward the cave entrance. His fingers were going numb despite his gloves, and he could feel the early signs of hypothermia creeping in. The adrenaline that had sustained him was wearing off, replaced by the bone-deep cold that killed more soldiers than bullets ever would. A memory surfaced unbidden. Afghanistan, winter of 2018, pursuing Taliban fighters through the Hindu Kush. His team had been trapped in a blizzard for 18 hours, and he'd learned that in conditions like these, movement meant life. Stop moving, start dying. The mantra had kept him alive then, and it would have to do so now. The cave mouth appeared through the swirling snow like a black wound in the hillside. Marcus approached carefully, using his tactical light to check for recent signs of animal habitation. Bear tracks, but old ones, probably from before the storm hit. He squeezed through the narrow opening, grateful for the immediate relief from the wind. Inside, the temperature was a balmy 20 degrees, tropical compared to the surface. He allowed himself 30 seconds to catch his breath and assess his situation. The cave system extended deep into the mountain, with multiple chambers and at least 2 other exits he knew of. It would take his pursuers time to search it thoroughly, assuming they even found the entrance in this storm. But caves brought their own dangers. Easy to get lost, easier to get trapped, and if they did find him inside, it would become his tomb. Marcus moved deeper into the cavern, his light revealing the familiar limestone formations. He'd cached some supplies here during his 2nd winter, basic survival gear in case he ever needed to disappear completely. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd prepared for this scenario without consciously planning for it, the paranoia of his former life proving prophetic. The cached supplies were exactly where he'd left them. Emergency rations, water purification tablets, a thermal blanket, and most importantly, a backup radio. Military grade, encrypted, with enough battery for maybe 6 hours of use. He powered it up and tuned to the emergency frequency, keeping his voice low as he transmitted his coordinates and situation. No immediate response, but someone might be listening. In the mountains, help was often hours away in good weather. In a blizzard like this, it might not come at all. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing, and somewhere in that white hell, 4 killers were hunting him. Marcus checked his weapon one more time and prepared to go deeper into the darkness. The muzzle flash lit up Kozlov's face for a split second, weathered features twisted in fury, ice crystals clinging to his beard. Marcus rolled hard to his left as the bullet splintered the wooden beam where his head had been. The echo of the gunshot was swallowed instantly by the howling wind. Marcus's shoulder screamed as he dove behind the overturned kitchen table, feeling the warm wetness spreading down his arm. Not arterial. He could still move his fingers. Good enough. "You cannot hide forever, Walker." Kozlov's voice carried over the storm. "My employer wants what you took. Give me the drive and I make it quick." Marcus pressed his back against the table, checking his rifle. 3 rounds left. He'd counted Kozlov's shots. The Spetsnaz operative had fired 4 times since entering the cabin. If he was carrying a standard magazine, that left him with 11 rounds, maybe more if he'd reloaded. The wind shifted, and Marcus caught the creak of floorboards near the fireplace. Kozlov was moving, using the storm's noise as cover. Smart. But Marcus knew every sound this cabin made, every board that groaned under pressure. He slipped his knife from its sheath, the blade catching what little light filtered through the shattered windows. The cold bit at his exposed skin, but his hands remained steady. Muscle memory never died, even after 10 years of trying to bury it. Another creak, closer now. Kozlov was circling toward the kitchen, probably planning to flank around the table. Marcus controlled his breathing, listening to the patterns in the wind. There, a brief lull in the gusts. He moved. Rolling out from behind the table, Marcus came up in a crouch and fired twice toward the sound. Wood exploded from the doorframe, but no grunt of pain, no body dropping. Kozlov had already moved. Still fast, came the Russian's voice from somewhere near the bedroom, but not fast enough. Marcus dove as automatic fire chattered behind him, splinters erupting from the floor where he'd been kneeling. He crashed into the corner where his emergency supplies were stashed, his wounded shoulder hitting the wall hard enough to make stars dance in his vision. 1 round left in the rifle. He needed to make it count. The storm was intensifying, the cabin shaking with each gust. Snow poured through the broken windows, creating a white curtain that moved and shifted with the wind. Marcus used it, staying low and moving toward the far wall where shadows pooled deepest. A footstep behind him, too close. Marcus spun, bringing the rifle up, but Kozlov was already there, appearing from the swirling snow like a ghost. The Russian's weapon was aimed center mass, unwavering despite the chaos around them. "Drop it," Kozlov commanded. Marcus lowered the rifle slowly, his mind racing through options. The knife was still in his left hand, hidden behind his thigh. Kozlov's eyes were hard, professional. He'd wait until Marcus was completely disarmed before moving in for the kill shot. "The drive, Walker." "Where is it?" "Safe," Marcus replied, shifting his weight imperceptibly. "Somewhere you'll never find it." Kozlov's smile was arctic. "I have time. The storm will last hours yet. I will tear this place apart, then work on you. I am very good at making people talk." The wind gusted again, harder this time, and the cabin's roof groaned ominously. Marcus felt rather than heard something shift overhead, snow loading, structural stress building to a breaking point. "Your move," he said quietly. Kozlov took a step forward, weapon steady. "Indeed it is." The roof beam cracked. Marcus threw himself sideways as a section of the ceiling collapsed, bringing down a cascade of snow and timber. Kozlov cursed in Russian, diving in the opposite direction as debris crashed between them. Marcus rolled, came up running and burst through the cabin's back door into the full fury of the blizzard. The cold hit him like a physical blow, instantly numbing his exposed skin. Visibility was zero. He could barely see his own hands. Behind him, he heard Kozlov shouting, then the sharp crack of gunfire. Bullets whined past, but in these conditions, Kozlov was firing blind. Marcus plunged into the white void, using the wind direction to maintain his bearing. His emergency cache was 50 yards north, buried under the old pine stump. If he could reach it, he'd have additional weapons, medical supplies, and winter gear. But each step was agony. The snow was knee-deep and getting deeper, the wind threatening to knock him down with every gust. His wounded shoulder had gone numb, which worried him more than the pain had. The sound of pursuit faded behind him, swallowed by the storm. Kozlov was good, but he didn't know this terrain. In a whiteout this severe, Marcus had the advantage, if he could stay alive long enough to use it. His foot hit something solid, the stump. Marcus dropped to his knees and began digging frantically through the snow, his fingers already losing sensation. The cache had to be here. It had to be. His numb fingers found metal, the cache lid. The wind had died to an eerie whisper, and in that sudden stillness, Marcus knew they were coming. The storm's eye had found them, creating a pocket of deceptive calm that would last maybe 20 minutes before the back wall hit with renewed fury. But 20 minutes was all Kozlov's remaining men needed. Marcus pressed his back against the ice-covered boulder, feeling the tremor in his left leg where shrapnel had torn through muscle. The makeshift tourniquet held, but dark spots danced at the edges of his vision. 3 days of cat and mouse through the wilderness had pushed his body beyond its limits, but his mind remained sharp as winter steel. Sarah huddled beside him, her face pale but determined. The journalist had proven tougher than he'd expected, keeping pace through terrain that would challenge seasoned soldiers. Her camera equipment was long gone, sacrificed to the storm, but she still clutched the encrypted drive containing evidence of Kozlov's arms trafficking network. "How many?" she whispered. Marcus closed his eyes, filtering the ambient sounds. Boot crunch on snow, barely audible. The scrape of equipment against fabric. 2 sets of footsteps, maybe 3, approaching from the northwest. Professional movement, but not quite Navy SEAL quiet. 3, maybe 200 meters out. He checked his rifle, 6 rounds left. The pistol had 2, not enough for a prolonged firefight. They're using the calm to close distance. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd come to these mountains to disappear, to bury the skills that had made him lethal. Now those same skills were the only thing keeping them alive. A branch snapped in the distance. Marcus's head snapped toward the sound, muscle memory flooding back. The familiar weight of the rifle in his hands, the way his breathing automatically slowed, the tunnel vision that came with imminent violence. He'd tried so hard to forget this feeling. "There's a ravine about 50 meters south," he murmured, scanning their escape route. "When I move, you run for it. Don't look back. What about you? I'll buy you time." His voice carried the flat certainty of a man who'd made peace with his choices. Sarah grabbed his arm. "There has to be another way." Marcus met her eyes, seeing the reflection of the man he'd tried to stop being. The operator who solved problems with controlled violence, who measured success in body counts rather than lives saved. But sometimes the old ways were the only ways. Movement flickered between the trees. A muzzle flash strobed in the grey twilight, and bark exploded from the pine beside Marcus's head. He rolled left, coming up with the rifle already tracking targets. The first shot took the lead gunman's center mass. The man dropped without a sound, his weapon clattering across frozen ground. Marcus was already moving, using the terrain like he'd been born to it, muscle memory overriding 3 years of self-imposed exile. Sarah ran. Good girl. The second shooter appeared from behind a deadfall, assault rifle chattering. Marcus dove behind a snow-laden spruce as bullets chewed through branches above his head. Pine needles rained down like green confetti. He counted muzzle flashes. 2 shooters left, maybe 3. They were trying to flank him using standard small unit tactics, professional but predictable. Marcus belly-crawled through the underbrush, ignoring the fire in his wounded leg. The snow here was deeper, muffling sound, and he used it to his advantage. 20 feet, 15, close enough to smell the gun oil and nervous sweat. He came up behind the flanker like a ghost from the white. One hand clamped over the man's mouth while the knife, his grandfather's old K-bar, found the gap between neck vertebrae. A quick, efficient movement, no suffering. The body settled into the snow with barely a whisper. 2 left, maybe 1. The wind began to pick up again, the storm's eye moving past. In minutes, visibility would drop to 0 and the real blizzard would resume. Marcus used the rising wind noise to mask his approach on the final shooter. This one was good, better than the others. He'd found solid cover behind a granite outcropping and wasn't taking unnecessary risks. Patient, disciplined, former military like Marcus. That made it personal. Marcus circled wide, using a dry creek bed for concealment. His wounded leg screamed with each step, but he pushed through the pain. He'd endured worse. Mogadishu, Afghanistan, places where pain was just another piece of gear you carried. The final exchange lasted 3 seconds. The shooter heard him coming, combat veterans always did, but Marcus had the angle. 2 quick shots, center mass, clean, professional. Silence returned to the forest, broken only by the rising wind. Marcus stood over the last body, watching blood seep into pristine snow. His hands were steady, his breathing controlled, just like always. He'd told himself he was done with killing. Apparently, killing wasn't done with him. "Marcus," Sarah's voice carried from the ravine. "Time to go." The storm was building again, and there was still one more hunter in these mountains, the most dangerous one. Kozlov himself was coming. The wind had finally died to a whisper, but Marcus Kane knew better than to trust the sudden calm. Through the shattered remnants of his cabin's window, dawn light filtered through the settling snow, casting everything in an ethereal blue-white glow. The storm was passing, but the real battle had only just begun. Dmitry Volkov lay motionless 20 feet away, his body partially buried in the drift that had blown through the destroyed wall. The Russian assassin's blood had crystallized into dark ribbons across the snow, but Marcus couldn't afford to assume he was dead. Not yet, not after everything. Marcus pressed his back against the overturned table he'd used for cover during their final confrontation. His left shoulder throbbed where Volkov's knife had found its mark, and he could feel the warm trickle of blood seeping through his makeshift bandage. 3 days of cat and mouse in the wilderness had pushed both men beyond their limits, but only one of them was walking away. The satellite phone crackled to life in the sudden quiet, its green display cutting through the dim morning light. Marcus had managed to repair it during the night, jury-rigging the antenna with wire from his destroyed radio. Now came the moment he'd been dreading. Contact with the outside world he'd spent 5 years avoiding. "This is Kane," he said into the device, his voice barely above a whisper. Static filled the air for several seconds before a familiar voice cut through. "Jesus Christ, Marcus, we thought you were dead." Commander Sarah Chen, his former handler, the woman who'd tried to bring him back into the fold more times than he could count. The woman who'd finally stopped calling 2 years ago. "Not dead," Marcus replied, keeping his eyes fixed on Volkov's still form. "But I need immediate extraction. Grid coordinates follow." As he rattled off his position, Marcus began moving carefully around the destroyed cabin, gathering what remained of his supplies. The storm might be ending, but he was still 40 miles from the nearest road, and Volkov hadn't been working alone. The phone intercepts Marcus had managed during their deadly game of hide-and-seek had confirmed at least 2 more operatives in the area. "Extraction team is already airborne," Chen said. "Should reach you within the hour. Marcus, we need to talk about why Volkov was hunting you, the intelligence you took when you disappeared." Later, Marcus cut her off, spotting movement in his peripheral vision. Volkov's eyes were open, pale blue and filled with the same cold determination that had made him legendary in the Spetsnaz. The assassin's hand moved incrementally toward the Makarov pistol, lying half-buried beside him. Marcus raised his own weapon, the Glock he'd taken from one of Volkov's dead teammates. "Don't." Volkov's lips curved into a bloody smile. "You cannot run forever, American. We know about the data. We know about Prague." "Prague is ancient history," Marcus said, though his finger tightened on the trigger. The mission that had gone sideways, the intelligence that had died with his team, except it hadn't died, had it? Somehow someone had survived to talk. "Your government betrayed your team," Volkov whispered, each word a visible puff of vapor in the freezing air. "But you already know this, yes? Is why you live like animal in woods." Marcus felt the old rage stirring, the fury that had driven him into these mountains in the first place. The mission briefings that hadn't matched reality. The extraction that never came. The 12 hours of hell that had cost him everything that mattered. "Who sent you?" Marcus demanded. Volkov's smile widened. "Does it matter? There will always be more. You have something that powerful men want buried." The distant sound of helicopter rotors began to echo through the mountains, growing steadily louder. Marcus's extraction was coming, but so was a choice he'd been avoiding for 5 years. Return to a world that had betrayed him, or disappear even deeper into the wilderness. "Your friends are here," Volkov said, his voice growing weaker. "But remember, we found you once. We will find you again." Marcus stood slowly, keeping the pistol trained on the dying assassin. Through the broken window, He could see the helicopter cresting the ridge, its military markings clearly visible against the morning sky. Chen had kept her word about the extraction, but that didn't mean she could be trusted with anything else. As the aircraft began its descent toward the small clearing beside his ruined cabin, Marcus made his decision. He would go with them, but not as the broken fugitive they expected. The storm had reminded him who he used to be, and Volkov's hunt had shown him that the past would never stay buried on its own. The helicopter touched down in a whirlwind of snow and rotor wash. Through the open cabin door, Marcus could see Chen's familiar silhouette waiting for him. Behind her sat 2 armed soldiers, their weapons held at ready positions. Marcus stepped over Volkov's now still body and walked toward his uncertain future, leaving his hermit's life buried beneath the settling snow.